Well, potatoes are an important southern Alberta crop, and they can be valuable in a rotation if managed carefully. Our next speaker is going to talk about the impacts of potato production on soil health and soil health on potato production. Dr. Jonathan Neilson is a potato health researcher at the Agriculture Canada Lethbridge Research and Development Centre. His work focused on potato tuber storability for seed and for processing, and some of the factors affecting that storability. This includes things like stress and even soil health factors in the field, as well as, of course, tuber storage management. So he's got research projects looking at how microorganisms in the soil affect potato vine growth and even storability. And he really values being able to partner with growers and industry to ensure that research discoveries do make a meaningful impact on potato production. So with that, let us welcome Dr. Neilson.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. As when I was first contacted by the organizers to give a talk, the suggested topic was on the impacts of potato production on soil health. And I will spend a little bit of time talking about that, but what I really wanted to do was to kind of flip the script on that narrative. So rather than focusing on the impacts of potato production on soil health, rephrasing it to look at what are the impacts of soil health on potato production. And the reason why I wanted to kind of make that change in mindset is because I think it kind of forces us to think more about the solutions to soil health rather than focusing on the problems or the issues when you're growing a particular crop. So to kind of begin with, as I mentioned, to kind of start this conversation, there are certainly some agricultural practices that apply to not just potato that tend to promote soil health, and then practices that tend to cause a decline in soil health. And this is pulled from a publication, just kind of giving a summary of that. So things that are known to cause soil health declines are things like aggressive tillage, annual crops, monocropping, removing crop residue, as well as a broad application of pesticides and chemicals. Things that tend to promote soil health include no-till or reduced tillage, the inclusion of cover crops, having longer rotations with more diversity in them, perennial crops, increasing crop residue retention, as well as adding organic soil amendments. Now, I don't think any of that is really news to anybody in this room, but to kind of focus on, again, just for a few minutes, talking about what are some of the issues that maybe are unique or more prevalent in potato production that will kind of help, formulate or inform the rest of the discussion. So some of the big ones, of course, are, potential for excessive nutrient application, chemical application. That is, again, is not unique to potato, but maybe is a bit worse in that system. But one that is maybe like the big low-hanging fruit of issues to address is this idea of tillage. So conventionally, potato has a fall seedbed preparation the year before potato. So there's a tillage event in the fall before potato is growing. You've got exposed ground over winter. You've got exposed ground in the spring before you plant. And then, of course, the harvesting process also has another tillage event. So the effects of this on to soil health are probably pretty obvious for anyone that's spent some time thinking about the topic. One is a reduction in soil organic carbon, and that's linked to long-term declines in productivity. But a big one that is really topical because of what happened the other week is soil erosion. So, now that we've spent a little bit of time kind of talking about what the challenges are, what I want to do is, again, flip that narrative and rephrase the question. Because I haven't really met a grower that is intentionally trying to ruin their soils. Growers are very conscientious of what their practices are having an impact on it. But what is maybe missing is the knowledge of what could be attempted in order to overcome those problems. And that's where I'm hoping that some of the research that I'm working on will kind of make a benefit. So rephrasing the question, as a grower, let's assume that you've decided you wanted to do something to promote soil health, so include a soil health promoting intervention, what are some of the options? And what I've started, and I haven't completed it yet, is a literature review to try and do a meta-analysis of the available body of knowledge out there. And generally, what I found is that you can break these intervention methods into 6 broad categories. So these are things like adding a biostimulant, so an organism that promotes plant and soil health to the system. Talked a little bit already about this idea of reducing tillage or moving tillage to spring, inclusion of cover crops, and then soil organic amendments, so adding manure from animal sources, compost from plant sources, as well as the idea of green manure, which would be a seeded crop that instead of harvested is incorporated in the soil. And a subsection of that would be biofumigation. So to kind of get a sense for, based on the literature out there, is how well do these practices work in terms of the impacts of inclusion on the potato production system. And it can be somewhat difficult to compare study to study because different units are different and the systems are different. So to kind of just get a general sense, what I did was I compared the conventional systems to the treatment that included one of these interventions and then just did a basic ratio. And so the first question I asked was, well, okay, so when you introduce one of these methods into a potato production, how often do you get an increase in potato production? And the first thing we're going to look at is just basic yield. So the graph on the left-hand side is showing a proportion of increased or better outcomes in terms of increased yield compared to decreased yield. And so what you can see is that with the exception of the spring tillage experiments, more often than not, when you introduce one of these intervention methods to improve soil health, you also see an increase in total yield. To break that down a little bit to get a bit more nuanced, I separated instances where there was an increase in yield versus instances where there was a decrease in yield and looked at kind of the mean change that we're seeing. And so the black boxes are where the average proportional increase when there was a better result, and the gray boxes are when the proportional decrease when there was a less result. And then the white bars are kind of the overall mean. So a couple of things to kind of take from this. One is that more often than not, when soil health promoting practice was introduced into conventional potato production, you had increased yield. And the magnitude of the increase on kind of like a whole, when you look at it generally, was higher than decreases. So I think this is kind of, positive in the sense that should you decide to include a soil health promoting practice in your systems, there's a lot of evidence that that's going to have a corresponding increase in potato production. But of course, not every system is the same and not every intervention is going to work in each system. And there are potential trade-offs because yield isn't the only trait that's important. So I'm going to give a couple more examples, focusing a bit more on disease or pathogens, and kind of give you sort of ideas of when it seems to work, when it doesn't seem to work, and then that'll kind of move into the next section that's kind of asking, well, what do we do with this information? So looking at specific examples of an intervention method, cover cropping, what you see on the screen is incidence of early die and common scab. And generally on the whole, when these practices were introduced, you saw a lower disease incidence. In the case of manure, parasitic nematodes are linked to early die as well as other potato diseases. And this is one of those examples where it's kind of a real mixed bag. So generally it seems when inclusion of manure, at least in the studies that we've looked at so far, there was an increase in parasite load, but the error bars that you see on it are quite large. So what that means is that sometimes it increased, sometimes it decreased. Common scab tended to be lower, but again, the variability is more than you saw in the cover cropping. And then looking at two more examples, one is the compost. Common scab is almost rate 1-to-1, but there's a little bit error around that, so not much effect there. Again, looking at parasitic nematodes, the general trend seems to be lower, but there's variability kind of indicating that sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't work great. And then green manure kind of shows the trend where it's a bit maybe more successful. So, you can look at all kinds of different metrics, and I think it's important for each grower to have an understanding of what it is that they want to address. What is it that you want to improve with your soil? What are the challenges you're facing on the plant health side of thing? And try and pick, based on the knowledge that exists out there, what intervention is going to hopefully work the best for you. And through this literature review and the data that we're collecting, we're hoping to try and put this in a central place where it can be accessible, but also as new studies come on, they can help inform and allow that kind of transfer of knowledge from other jurisdictions to make work in southern Alberta. So talk a little bit about future perspectives. I think there's a big need to kind of settle on what are the low-hanging fruit. So what are the areas of concern with potato production? And this could apply to any crop, but we're talking about potato because that's what I work on. And based on that, what are the biggest opportunities to see gains, both in soil health promotion, but also in potato production? And I kind of already mentioned this, that two of the big ones I think that are out there is this idea of soil erosion, soil carbon. And linked to that is the potential for this idea of leveraging the microbial community to increase plant health, plant production, while also decreasing inputs. So just to kind of give an example of where maybe this will work, it's something that we need to think about, but there's challenges beyond just making it work. So barriers to adoption, it's been mentioned before, there's cultural barriers to adoption, there's logistics, expenses, things like that. But spring tillage is one of these kind of examples where, if we could make it work, maybe it would make a really big positive impact. When I looked at the literature, again, still going through the data, but the general trend seems to be that when spring tillage was incorporated, there was a bit of a decline in potato production. Now, this statistically wasn't significant, but I mean, you live in the real world, you don't live in the science world of statistics. So the question then becomes, so if there's a bit of an impact, how comfortable am I with that decline if I'm seeing a big gain somewhere else? And in this particular study, what they were looking at was percent ground cover and how that would impact erosion control. So what they found was that when they kept doing the fall tillage, even though they added cover crops, there was still not as much ground cover and they had higher erosion rates. When they moved the tillage to spring, they had less erosion, more ground cover. Now, this is where we can kind of give you guidance in terms of if you do this, this is what we've seen in other jurisdictions, and it hopefully will work with you. But it's up to you to kind of balance within your operations whether the decline that you might see is worth the added benefit to the soil health. Now, this kind of leads to another question. It's like, so if we can't convince people to adopt spring tillage because of whatever reasons exist and we can't address the concerns that are out there, what are some of the things we could try? And, there's all kinds of spectrum in terms of stuff that is, more standard, easier to implement versus things that maybe are kind of crazy. And I want to be crazy for just a minute or two and kind of talk about this idea of artificial biocrusts. So the idea here, a biocrust, if you're not familiar, is kind of this matrix of soil as well as a microorganism, so algae or bacteria or fungi. And what it kind of does is it forms like a glue surface on the soil. And what they found when they took bare sand and they were creating these artificial biocrusts, what they did is they then put it into a wind tunnel and did an erosion test. So the black lines on that are bare sand, and then the colored lines are two different microorganisms that were used to form these biocrusts. And the different graphs are increasing wind velocities, but what you can see is that the percentage of the soil that was lost in the wind tunnel was much less when these biocrusts were present. Now, I mean, it is kind of crazy for us to all of a sudden say, okay, well, we're gonna plant algae all over the place. I just wanted to kind of put it out there as kind of like this idea that we need to start thinking about what are the easy things we can do, what are the hard things that we can do, and is there ways to do the hard things through a novel method that we're maybe not thinking about? And so in the long term, agriculture is going to have to change. It's going to have to adapt to climate scenarios. It's also going to have to change to economic realities, things like that. And so what we're hoping, or what I'm hoping, is that we can have these conversations to sort of figure out where do people fall on the comfort level, and then how can we drive the knowledge base forward so that it can make an actual impact. So this kind of leads to the last part of my presentation, where I'm kind of focusing on some tools. So with this, I think a big thing that isn't really understood very well is what is the variability within a system. So, we already kind of mentioned that sometimes when you introduce a method to control or improve soil health, it works really well, and then sometimes it doesn't. But even within a single field, there can be these hot spots where you have a worse problem in one part of the field and another, and not as bad a problem in this other part. So the question is, should we treat the entire field the same, or can we do something to understand that field and that system, and then tailor the interventions that have the most impact? And so what I've been working on is kind of this idea. I started working on plant phenotyping, which is measuring traits about plants, so heights, yields, things like that, for use with our breeding program. But what we're trying to do is kind of push that technology out for it to be used as a management tool, and then also apply those basic principles to soil health. So this is just kind of an example of a project that started last year. COVID delayed some of our progress on it, but we were able to collect a little bit of data. In this example, potato was grown in this field in 2020, and then a green manure crop was planted in 2021, and there was also some cattle grazing that was put onto it. So it's a regenerative agriculture project. One of the things that we did with this is we set up a grid system into it, and we went out and we took soil cores in the spring, which is the left-hand graph, and then again in the fall. So after the potato, before the green manure crop, and then after the green manure crop, before the land was tilled up for next year's crop. So we're trying to find ways that we can, very quickly take a measurement that's going to tell us something about the variability within the system, and then put that into some way to interpret it so that it can be used as a management tool. And so one of the first things that we tried was just measuring soil reflectance. So this is going to be an indication of soil color, which is linked to a number of soil health parameters. So each one of these cores, I took the reflectance measurement, and there's an example graph in the top right-hand corner. And we were able to group these into 7 different categories. So these are soil cores that have similar reflectance to each other and are presumably more similar to each other than they are to the other groups. And then we went back to the maps, and we created a contour map of these groupings. So a couple things to kind of point out. In spring, the field has much more of these kind of like different contours. There was more groupings, which indicates that after the potato production, the soil, whatever we're measuring with the spectrum, we still need to figure that out, is much more different between the field. After the green manure crop, one of the things you'll notice is that that white and the light gray category covers much more of the field. And that indicates that our green manure crop had the effect of making the field more homogeneous, at least in the way that we're measuring it. So what we can hope to do with this is to kind of identify potential management zones, and if we can link the spectrum back to soil health parameters, so maybe carbon content or other things of interest, we can use that as a quick way to kind of generate a variability map within the field. Another method that we were looking at to address soil aggregate stability is by calculating something called a slaking index. And we're using a machine vision camera in order to do this, and the hope is that we can do many more samples at a time. So it's trying to increase the throughput so we can do more sampling and get an answer turnaround much faster. The way it works is that you take dried soil, you take a piece of soil, you take a picture of it, and then you put it into water. And what you see on the screen is 10 seconds and 10 minutes later. And what happens is the piece of soil breaks apart. And so the rate that it breaks apart and the size that that piece of soil becomes gets converted into the slaking index number. where the higher the number is, the less stable the soil is. So when it gets wet, it tends to break down faster and more of it breaks apart. After calculating the slaking index for each soil core, we then went back and created those contour maps. And a couple of things to point out, again, the left-hand side is the spring measurement, and then the right-hand side is after the green manure crop. Darker indicates lower slaking values, which indicates more stable soils. So generally, the green manure crop had the effect of reducing the slaking index, which indicates that the soil is more stable. Hopefully that means it's more resistant to erosion. But there's still kind of some of these hot spots. And what we did just kind of look at into that a little bit is we did a difference map. So the map that is on the screen that is mostly black, that is the difference between the spring values and the fall values. So most of it is black, which indicates that there was an improvement in aggregate stability, but there's a couple of zones in there where it's white, which actually indicates that aggregate stability declined. So what we're hoping to do with this is to use this data in order to create this idea of management zones and to go back to it to do a more thorough investigation to try and figure out what is it that's different in this part of the field versus the rest of the field that might account to that, and is that linked to other soil health parameters, and is it linked to plant health and potato production? And the other thing I'll kind of mention is that a lot of the stuff I've showed you is kind of on the soil health side of it. We're also developing methods to assess plant health and using publicly available sources. So this is an example of an NDVI map, which is a greenness indicator. And what I want to kind of highlight here is that much like we saw with the soil health maps that I just showed you, there are hot spots within this field where the yellow and the red represent plants that have wilted or they've started to undergo senescence early. So this might be an indication of early die. So we've developed a number of other platforms that I don't have really time to go into, but I'd be happy to talk about later, where we're looking at other traits, so tuber shape, specific gravity, fry color, trying to develop ways to assess that kind of on the fly and at much higher data intensity. And then the idea is to kind of combine these data sets together to look for covariates. And then if we can develop that, then maybe before the field gets planted, you can identify potential problem spots. And then it's up to the grower to determine what they think the best course of action is. So what I'm hoping to provide on my end of things is the tools and the knowledge in order for the assessment to be done, and then assisting growers in actually being able to come up with management practices that work on their farm in terms of obtaining the objectives, so soil health and potato production, but also meet other concerns that exist. So that just kind of summarizes some of the things that's going on. Most of these projects have just started in the last year or so, so we're still kind of working on them. A bit of acknowledgement, so working with Keshav Singh and Ann Smith, who was there previously, as well as the potato breeding program. And some of this was funded through ARDAR. And if there's time, I'll take some questions.
We do have a couple minutes, so if anybody has a question. John.
Is there any applications to dry bean production or sugar beet production?
So
Similar erosion issues.
Yeah. So one of the projects that I mentioned is funded through AFC, and the title of the project is carbon cropping. So again, it's the idea that we're not able to decide what the grower is growing in terms of the crops they are doing, but what happens when you add a crop that is meant to specifically put carbon into the system? So in that, we've got a rotation that has potato, wheat, sugar beans, and dry bean. And it is this kind of question of how much do you have to tailor the crops that you're putting in based on, even things like, the time to harvest, because that's going to determine whether you can get a successful fall catch crop, nurse crop, things like that. So the technologies that we're working on, the goal is that we use a common piece of equipment, we adapt it to work with the crop, and then we tailor the analytics to make sense for the operation. Now, it's not going to work in every instance, but that's part of the research project. But that's the general idea, is that if we find out how to make this work in potato, why not apply it to sugar beet? Why not apply it to beans, things like that?
Okay, up front, we've got a question here. Go ahead.
About the BioQuest idea, what's the concept?
Yeah, so the idea with BioCrest, they're commonly found in desert systems, as well as, just anywhere where you have like water all of a sudden and then it goes away. So the idea of the BioCrest is that the microorganisms in it, so bacteria, fungi, algae, as they're growing, they produce like mucus or carbon that's kind of excreted out into it. And in desert systems, it's a strategy to adapt to this idea where sometimes I have lots of water and I'm going to grow like gangbusters as much as I can, but then I need to be able to survive the dry periods. And so the idea with it is that you basically colonize a field with whatever organism you're looking at doing. So you could potentially apply it as a spray. You could potentially mix it in with your irrigation if you've got that capability. And as the plants are growing, they'll kind of grow initially and they'll feed off of the nutrients that are in the soil. And then when conditions start to dry out, they'll kind of exude these carbon into the surface. And because they only are in like that little top layer, they'll tend to form kind of like a glue along the surface. And so the hope is that that's going to reduce the amount of wind erosion that can come.
But it wouldn't impact crop production going forward.
We need to test that, but that's the idea. And then, the other thing is, if we think about this kind of idea of carbon cropping, it's very common to use like cover crops and green manure. I say common, there's a lot of interest and people are doing it. But there is this kind of question in my mind, and I was talking about it earlier, it's like, a lot of the stuff we're using for cover crops was bred and is intentioned to be used as a cash crop. So is it really the best thing to do? Algae, if you want to, say, just increase the amount of carbon in your system, you could potentially just inject it, or you could put it on the surface. Some of the studies that I've looked at where they've experimented with this on small plots, they see a carbon spike. It's transitory, but it tends to increase yield. But it depends on the species and the environment that you're looking at, like everything.
Is that the same idea where you see on construction projects? Sometimes after a fresh construction project, they'll spray stuff on that sort of.
It would be a very analogous idea. Or anytime they're doing like seeding and they have like the seed coat that's kind of like a gum along the surface, it would be the same idea, except instead of producing that through, say, a fossil fuel, you're growing it as an algae. So it's also this idea of, can we replace something that we do with the field that emits CO2 in the creation of that product with something that actually takes in CO2. So growing algae on, say, wastewater or something like that, where it, detoxifies it, and then you're adding carbon in the system plus the function of soil erosion control or whatever you're looking for.
Double bonus. Okay, we had a question somewhere down here. I thought I saw a hand. Okay. Okay, so I wrecked it. Oh, and I'd been quiet all day, really. All right. Well, fascinating research work, and so what's kind of this next year phase? What are you going to be kind of heading into next year?
So last year was kind of an establishment phase where we planted the 4 crops, and then the idea is that we're just shifting the rotation one plot over. But what we did is we put in a fall catch crop. And then we're going to put a nurse crop in with the potato and the sugar beet, and then put in a fall catch crop afterwards. And so we have the control where we don't have the cropping, and what we're looking for is asking the question, so when we did this, how much carbon did we get back into the soil? Was there any knock-on effects? So did it improve the yield or the quality of the crop that was coming off of it? And did we at least break even with the amount of carbon? Because of course you're going to expend more fuel and energy and that kind of thing.
Well, interesting research. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Dan. We've got a giant-sized shoehorn for you to remember your time at Farming Smarter. We appreciate that. Let's put our hands together again for Dr. Dan Neilson.